If you have your copy of God's Word, Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11. And we don't have a lot of time this morning to open up a couple of things. I want to make some addresses here in a moment. We have a lot of ground to cover this morning. I'm mindful of the time, and I will promise you, I'll make a pledge to you that I will keep my eye on the time. But there's a lot here, so without any delay, Daniel chapter 11. I'm not going to ask you to stand this morning because I am going to read the entirety of the chapter. So I'd ask you that you would follow there along with me, though, in Daniel chapter 11. This is the word of the Lord. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out among the 4 points of the compass. Though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed. After some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful agreement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and will deal with them with great and display great strength. Also their gods and their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt. And on his part, he will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. The king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. And when the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. But the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of such years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. He will set his face to come with the power of the whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him a daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So he will turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but will stumble and fall and be found no more. Then in his place one will arise, who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. In his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. And after alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. But he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to the land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. And at the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but the last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For the ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness, who act wickedly towards the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, which he prosper until the indignation is finished. For that which decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or to the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and horsemen and many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. He will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, but they will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost sons of Ammon. But he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Well, as you can see, this is very easy to understand. I was sharing with Jerry just a few weeks ago the difficulty that I was finding here as I began to study chapter 11. And he encouraged me by referring me to a sermon that Alistair Begg had preached as he preached through the book of Daniel. And as he opens Daniel chapter 11, he opens with the same confounding statement. He said, I thought that chapter 9 was the most difficult chapter in the book of Daniel until I got to chapter 11. And he quoted what I had actually read in a couple of different commentaries. One of the commentaries that I read quoted another pastor who said that Daniel chapter 11 is great for Bible colleges and seminaries, but it is not fit to develop a sermon from. In fact, Calvin, in his commentary, gave over 100 pages to the exposition of chapter 11. Now, I promise you we're not going to do that this morning, but I am going to steal one other thing from Dr. Begg this morning. As he told his church what he was going to do as he preached Daniel chapter 11 is practice what he had determined to call planned neglect. And so as we go through this chapter this morning, there's no way that we can, nor would it be beneficial actually, to spend the entirety of our time this morning to unfold every single nuance of what we find here in chapter 11. It is a difficult chapter to exegete sermonetically, not because it's difficult in the historicity of this chapter, but just because what we have is 40 plus verses that are basically a history lesson of the entirety of the unfolding of the high points and the significant events of human history from the time of Daniel to the time of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Now, it's important because it's going to overflow, and we're going to see this continued theme of God's sovereignty throughout it all. But it's not just a history lesson, it's a history lesson that is then enveloped in prophetic language. Because we don't find here clear, definitive terms of who these people are. We find the king of the north, the king of the south, and then the daughter of the king of the south. And we find all of this kind of shrouded in there. And so we have to again, talk about the history, but we have to also unfold it a little bit in order to make it clear and in order for us to understand exactly what's going on there. I would refer you, if you have a desire to really deep dive into the history that's found here in Daniel chapter 11, I would refer you to two books. And the first of those is a book by Philip Mauro, M-A-U-R-O, entitled The 70 Weeks and the Great Tribulation. Or I would also refer you to Ian Duguid's commentary on Daniel. Both of those books are rich in resources as it comes to the greater part of Daniel chapter 11. So instead, what I endeavor to do this morning is just to give us, I can't even call it a highlight because we're going to have to deep dive into some of this morning. I had intended, hopefully, to be able to cover the entirety of this but in one sermon, but I think it will probably take a couple of sermons in order for us to be able to unfold all of this and to give it its fair shake and how we need to see this in the theme of God's sovereignty throughout the book of Daniel. Now, for those of you who are visiting with us this morning, this is not typically the way that we would look at a chapter, but again, we have to deal with what we have before us. And so we're kind of switch directions a little bit in how we look at this. But what I want you to keep in the back of your mind, again, throughout the entirety of our time here in Daniel chapter 11, as we have all the way through the book of Daniel, is that overarching theme of God's sovereignty. The book of Daniel, as encouraging as it is to see Daniel's bravery and his resilience against the forces of Babylon, and we should take and learn from those lessons as much as we can, because God did give those to us. But again, that constant theme is to see that God is the one who rules over all things. God is the one who rules over the world. God is the one who rules over nations. God is the one who rules over leaders. And God is the one who rules over your life and my life. And so we find the strong level of encouragement there. And as we see history unfold here, what we find here is, again, that picture of how God has perfectly done exactly what he intended to do. So now I would remind you, as we dive into this morning, Daniel is getting this at the end of the Babylonian era. Darius the Mede is now ruling. The Medes have taken over Babylon and is ruling, and Daniel gets this final prophecy. So everything that Daniel is relaying to us this morning through his book is things that have yet to happen. These are things that Daniel will never see in his lifetime. These are things that are going to happen over the next subsequent generations after him. Now, we have the ability now to look back and to see how through Daniel, God declared and proclaimed and perfectly laid out the entire course of human history, as I said earlier, from the time of Daniel all the way through to the time of Christ. If there's ever a place in the Bible where we can come to and see just the beautiful orchestration of how God is in control of everything, it's found here in Daniel chapter 11. Because everything that Daniel describes in this chapter, speaking prophetically to the future, everything that he describes here has come to pass in perfect and clear history. Now, as we begin, I want to call your understanding to the fact that the first 35 verses of Daniel chapter 11 are pretty much without controversy. No matter which end times camp you fall into, pretty much all of them are in agreement on the first 35 verses of the chapter. As far as the history that it's laid out and how it covers that epoch of time, all parties agree. It's not until we get to verse 36 that disagreement begins to arise, and we'll discuss a little bit more about that when we get to those verses. But I want you to notice first here as the chapter begins to open, and I read all of this in its entirety for us at the beginning because we're not going to have time in each section to go back and look at each verse. We're going to kind of look at themes of verses at times as we move through this chapter. But verse 2 opens up there and talks about three more kings that are going to arise in Persia, and then a fourth king that will come out of them. That fourth king, it says, would be rich and would wound and would stir up all his realm against Greece. Now, this is Xerxes. Xerxes, who invaded Greece with his force and then that was defeated later on, leading to the downfall of the Persian Empire. So again, what we're seeing in this chapter unfolding is just a historical timeline of all of these events. So Daniel now begins to write, and what he writes here is beginning to show the downfall of the Persian Empire and the kingdom of Greece coming in. Verses 3 and 4 talk about a mighty king who's going to arise with great authority and do as he pleases. I would hearken you back to remember our study earlier when we talked about the nation of Greece. We talked about Alexander the Great. This is who he is being described again here in verses 3 and 4. You can see that as that he will do what he pleases, great authority. He goes out into the far kingdoms of the world. And then notice here the description in verse 4 that it says his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out among the 4 points of the compass. You remember when Alexander the Great, when he died, and his kingdom was so vast, so large, it could not be ruled by one other person after him. So it was divided into 4 kingdoms. And notice again there in verse 4, it says, through not to his own descendants, none of Alexander the Great's own progeny ascended to the throne, but it was divided amongst others. And so all of his authority, all of his sovereignty would be rooted out and given to others. So this is a description there of Alexander the Great. Of those 4 kingdoms that were divided out, the nation of Israel really only had major dealings with 2 of those kingdoms. That was the Seleucids, which was the kingdom of Syria, and the Ptolemies, which was the kingdom of Egypt. Now, at that time, the Ptolemies who were in Egypt were of Greek descent. The Greeks were ruling there in Egypt, and so you'll find reference to that. We'll come back to that at different times. But the 2 that we're going to see when we see kingdoms of the north and south most often here in this chapter is referring to the kingdom of Syria or the kingdom of Egypt. Verses 5 through 19, and we're going to look at each one of these, some of these individually, but they basically describe the battles and events that happened between those 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of Syria, which is to the north, and the kingdom of Egypt, which was to the south. Verse 5 says, then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion, and his dominion will be great indeed. This is the beginning of the Egyptian victories that they won in various battles throughout different times in this period. Verse 6 tells of an alliance that would happen. And notice there it says they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. Ptolemy Philadelphus, who was again in Egypt, gave his daughter Bernice to marry Antiochus Theos of Syria. This was an agreement to try to put to bed the battles that had been happening between the 2 countries. The agreement was that if Ptolemy Philadelphus would give his daughter Bernice to Antiochus, that he would put away his first wife, Laodice, and only take Bernice as his wife. Not long after this agreement happened and the 2 were married, Ptolemy Philadelphus died, and instead Antiochus put away Bernice, took back his first wife, who then, in anger at being crossed, murdered both him and Bernice, his second wife. So we can see this. It's almost like a soap opera being played out for us in practicality. After that, the brother of Ptolemy Philadelphus, Ptolemy Evergenelis, out of her roots. Notice there it says in verse 7 there, one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place. He came to avenge his niece's death by invading Syria. And his efforts to do so, and the subsequent victory is outlined for us there in verses 7 through 9. So again, you're dealing with unsaved people here. You're dealing with people who are corrupt, people who are wicked, people who are driven by power and greed and the lust for more. And so anything they can do, they're going to do in order to try to continue their success in leading their countries, gaining more power, and gaining more influence. So now, the north and the south, they tried to come to this agreement, but again, they despised each other and they went back against their word. And so in verses 7 through 9, we find there, as the Egyptian kingdom comes and attacks against the Syrian kingdom. These battles and these wars did not last forever, however. Look in verse 10. Verse 10 says, his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. This describes the Syrian king Antiochus the Great, who went to war with Egypt. At the battle, they experienced some successes. But verse 11, notice, it says, the king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise up a great multitude, but that multitude will be given to the hand of the former. So although the Assyrians experienced some victory at the beginning, the Egyptian king was moved with anger and ended up mounting a greater army and ended up defeating them. Verses 12 through 14 continue more in the life of Antiochus. He set to war against the Syrians. Again, he was about 14 years later. During this time, he was aided, it tells us here in the Scriptures, by some of the Jews who had apostatized in the kingdom. And for their help, Antiochus was for a period of time favorable to them. Now, you're going to notice throughout this chapter, you're going to hear a lot of repeated terms. And where I can, I try to emphasize the fact it's just like how it is with the Caesars. You have a lot of Caesars. Caesar doesn't just refer to one person. It's a title that's given. But oftentimes in descriptions in the Scripture, you will see just the word Caesar used. But sometimes you'll see Caesar Augustus or Julius Caesar, things like that. And the same thing with Antiochus. Here we're referring to Antiochus the Great. Later on, we're going to be looking at a different Antiochus when it comes to the latter part of the Jewish history that's being unfolded to us here. So as these battles continue to take place between the north and the south, Antiochus was able to call over some Jews who had apostatized and had rebelled against the Jewish faith, and they began to assist him. And so for that, he was favorable to them in the very beginning. Notice in verse 16, it says, but he who comes against him will do as he please, and no one will be able to withstand him, because he will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. So he comes into the land of Israel. And history, I believe it was Josephus who outlines this, says that when he comes in such a way that many of the people accept him because he comes in such a peaceful way. He does not come in trying to take over, but he comes in to try to build up the accolades and try to basically bribe the people to assist him in the things that he was doing. Because it tells us that by his hand, he has destruction in his hand. Other translations say that by his hand they will be consumed, because not all was going to go well for the nation of Israel with Antiochus here. As part of his plans against Egypt, Antiochus the Great, we're going to find a repeat of events of the past. Antiochus the Great gives his daughter Cleopatra to the Egyptian king Ptolemy Epiphanes. However, and so they had set up this plan. He told his daughter, I'm going to give you in hand in marriage to the Egyptian king, and when you get there, you're going to work behind the scenes for me, and you're going to help us to accomplish a victory over the Egyptian kingdom. However, instead of siding with her father, she sided with her new husband. And so in verse 17, we find the description to that. It says, he will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of woman to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So again, this is Cleopatra, daughter of Antiochus the Great, who was married off to Ptolemy Epiphanes, but again, she sided with her new husband and not with her father. Now, after this, it tells us in verse 18, he says, then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. Now, after this, after his daughter deceived him and did not go through with their plan, Antiochus set his eyes on Rome, but he was defeated there. So he returned to Syria, and as he returned to Syria, there we find here, he will turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but will stumble and fall and be found no more. When Antiochus the Great returned to Syria, his people were angry at him for several reasons. Number one, he had put on them exorbitant taxes to cover these great military battles that he was setting out on. Fighting costs money. And so as he was going out to fight battles against Egypt, to fight battles against Syria, he just kept levying more and more taxes against the people of Syria, and they were done with it. As he had now gone and fought against Rome and had lost, now Rome had exercised tribute to him. If you were a nation and you lost a battle against Rome, you were now somewhat under their control or under their thumb, and they said, now you got to pay us money. So as Antiochus the Great returns to Syria, the people now know they've been paying exorbitant taxes to him already. Now they're going to have to start paying more money to Rome, so they do what was natural in the days of this time. They rose up and killed Antiochus the Great. And so verse 19 tells us he will stumble and fall and be found no more, highlights his death by the hand of his own people. Now, verse 20 is one of the only places in these opening verses where there is some disagreement amongst commentators on who this is referring to. Verse 20 tells us that in his place, speaking of Antiochus, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. Some say this refers to a man named Jason who rose up in Palestine, who bribed his way into the high priesthood, and who eventually was taken out. Others say this refers to the son of Antiochus the Great, who had to raise even more large sums of money to pay the tribute that was owed by his father, and again the taxes to cover those battles that he had been facing. But let's continue on. Verses 21 through 35 are all focused on a person who we have already spoken of in our earlier studies here in the book of Daniel. And this is Antiochus Epiphanes. So not Antiochus the Great, this is Antiochus Epiphanes. This was the successor to Antiochus the Great. And you remember, we talked about him earlier when Daniel would give that prophecy of a time which would come in the nation of Israel, when one who would rise up and cause the worship to cease, who would desecrate the temple, who would make vile sacrifices in the temple, and who would inhibit the worship of God there in Jerusalem. The wickedness and savagery that the people of God experienced under this Antiochus was far worse than anything they'd experienced under any previous ruler to this point in history. Verse 21 to 23 describes his rise to power, which was somewhat peaceful. And again, he worked by flattery. He worked in a deceitful way in coming in. And this is not new, right? This is what we see most often in the rise of some great political leader who ends up being corrupt. Most oftentimes they come into a place promising people everything that they want, promising people that everything is going to be better, that if you put me in power, if you allow me to rule, then everything will be glorious for you. It's the same thing that Antiochus did. Verse 21, it says, "A despicable person will arise, on whom the honorship of kingship has not been conferred." If you remember back to our study of this, you remember he was not in the lineage of those who ultimately would come into power. He says, "But he will come in a time of tranquility or a time of peace, and seize the kingdom by intrigue," that is, bribery or deceit. Now, Josephus describes these events well. I would refer you to his book on the history of the Jewish people because he goes into such great detail on many of these events. Verse 22 through 24 talk about what he's going to do. Notice there it says, "The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him." Verse 23, "After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception. He will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In the time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm and will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him." If you remember, in the time of Antiochus, he fought against Egypt, and then he had a second battle against Egypt. In that second battle against Egypt, he was defeated soundly. And in his anger, which is described for us here in verse 25, his defeat made him so angry that he came back and he began to attack the nation of Israel. The continuation of that second attack there is in verse 28 and verse 28 through 30. And so he comes back angry, not particularly at the nation of Israel, but angered at his defeat in Egypt, and he has to take it out on someone. So he comes back to the nation of Israel in anger at his defeat in Egypt, and that's when he begins to do the things that he desires to do. Verse 30, we arrive at the height of his wickedness. Therefore it says he will be disheartened and will return and will become enraged at the holy covenant, talking about the nation of Israel, and will take action, and he will come back and show regard for those who force the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary, the fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. I would refer you again back to that sermon just a few weeks ago where we covered this in greater detail. But this was a time for the nation of Israel that would have just set them on their heels and knocked the breath out of them. It was a time in which everything that they had given their life to in the worship of God, being able to go to the temple and make the sacrifices and worship God in a faithful and honoring way, all of that was taken away from them because he forbid the sacrifices to take place. And not only that, he totally desecrated the temple by doing vile and evil things inside of it, setting up a statue of Zeus, sacrificing a pig on the altar. And if you're familiar with Jewish history and Jewish belief, you understand that a pig is the most unclean animal to the Jewish people. So to bring this unclean animal inside to the temple, into the most holy place, and sacrifice that pig there was such a great affront to the people of Israel. Now I want to call your attention for just a moment to verse 32. It says, "By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action." Daniel here is speaking of two types of Jews during this period of time. That during this period of the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes and his vile actions there in the temple, there are two types of people. He says, by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly towards the covenant. But then the second group of people is the people who know their God, who will display strength and take action. The first group is those groups of Jews who apostatized. In any given nation, when an evil leader rises up, there are those who will eventually capitulate and give over to the evilness that is at hand. So as Antiochus rose to power, there were even some Jews who did not fight back, who did not stand up against it, but instead joined in to Antiochus's evilness and began to follow after him. That's that first group. But what I want us to focus on this morning is that second group of people. He says the people who know their God will display strength and take action. I want to spend some time at the end talking about this. But before we move on, I just want to say this morning, aren't you thankful that God always has a faithful remnant? That in the midst of such great difficulty, in the midst of such great trial and tribulation, it tells us here that the people who know their God will display strength and take action. So how do we know God, right? How did they know God? Well, they knew God because they had a true relationship with him. They knew God because they trusted in his word. But I want you to notice here that trust in God and that knowledge of God did not stop just at pure knowledge, but that they displayed strength and took action. That meant that they did something. So who here is the scripture referring to? Let's read just a couple of more verses. It says, those who have insight among the people, again, referring to those who know their God, he says, will give understanding to the many. So those who knew God did what the scripture tells us that we should do, is that we share that knowledge with others. We train them, we encourage them, we disciple them. So those here who Daniel is speaking of says that in this time they began to give understanding to the many. But notice there it says, yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. These who served the Lord faithfully were not without persecution. They did not escape without trial and tribulation. It says, now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So through the midst of this trial, through the midst of this difficulty, those who are being faithful to the Lord, those who are being obedient to him will encounter sword and peril and fall by the way. But notice that it's happening that they would be refined and purged and made pure. God never allows his people to suffer needlessly. And God did this in such a way as to purify even more continually his people, even in the midst of such great difficulty. Now, commentators are in agreement that most likely who this is referring to here is the family of Matthias the priest and his sons. Most of you probably are familiar with this. It's called the Maccabean Revolt. And it's referred to us and given to us in the book of Maccabees in the Apocrypha. You can read that. It's a good historical account of this event. But Matthias and his 5 sons led a successful revolt against Antiochus. It lasted for a number of years, But it was a small group of people, him and his 5 sons, but they succeeded in getting a large group of people to come alongside of them and to fight back against Antiochus and the wickedness that he was doing. And in doing so, they continued to train others. They continued to share their knowledge and share their insight. Again, it was not without defeat. Some of them died, some of them suffered, but God used all this to strengthen his people in the midst of a tumultuous and difficult time. Now here, we arrive at verse 36. Are we doing okay? Everybody still here? All good? Okay. Now verse 36 is where it changes. As I said earlier, the first 35 verses of this book are really uncontested amongst scholars and commentators and different positions in eschatology. But verse 36, it changes because we find here, not a switch in direction, but we find here a different lineage here. Because there in verse 36, it says, then the king will do it as pleases. But I want you to notice there first in verse 35, it is still to come at the appointed time. He says he will make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So we find right there somewhat of a closure to a period or an epoch of time. And then it continues on there in verse 36, for then the king will do as he pleases. As we begin on this section, I want to just highlight a few interpretations before I give you what I believe to be the identification of this king referred to in verse 36. Now some believe that this king is just a continuation of the life and actions of Antiochus Epiphanes. We just finished looking at him in those latter part of those verses there in chapter 11. However, those who hold to this position also hold to the position that 2 of the 4 kingdoms that we saw in chapter 2 are Media and Persia. So they would view the 4 kingdoms of the great statue there in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of being Babylon, Media, Persia, and then Greece. However, you'll remember in our study that as we looked at that, the Media-Persian Empire was not a separated kingdom. It was 2 kingdoms, but they were a united kingdom, which means that the 4 kingdoms we find there in that statue are Babylon, Media-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. So we don't find here, I don't believe, in my understanding, a continuation of Antiochus Epiphanes' life. Some think that it refers to Constantine the Great. Calvin thought that it referred to the Roman Empire. Some see it as a reference to the Pope. Perhaps the most popular viewpoint that exists today and has for a number of years is that what happens between verses 35 and 36 is that there is a break in the passage, and that the remainder of chapter 11 refers not to the time or the actions of anything that happened in the life of Daniel or subsequent to Daniel, but has yet to happen at some point in the future, and refers to the character or the figure that is most commonly known as the Antichrist. I will share this morning, I do not hold to that position. In fact, I would quote Philip Morrow, who says, the strongest magnifying glass in the world would needed to be used to reveal any indication of such a break here in this passage. I want you to read it with me. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Then the king will do as he pleases. It doesn't seem there that there is any break, much as when we studied Matthew 24. And we saw there that Jesus, as he's speaking to his disciples, uses the word this generation multiple times during that passage. And every time the word by all camps of eschatology say that Jesus means this generation, means the people who he's talking to there in front of him, which is what the word means. But then we arrive at Matthew 24, where Jesus again uses the same word for this generation as he's used in every other place in the book of Matthew. And all of a sudden, some eschatological viewpoints say, well, now he's talking about some day yet far into the future that we don't know when Jesus uses the exact same words. So I would call our attention here that nothing that Daniel writes, nothing that we find here in this passage seems to indicate that there is a break in this passage. In fact, I would argue the point that what we see here is a continuation of Jewish history, because we've already looked at Babylon through the earlier parts of the book of Daniel. Here in chapter 11, we have seen the Media-Persian Empire. We've seen the Greek Empire, which leaves us what at the end of that period of time? It leaves us the Roman Empire. So if the Roman Empire is one of the greatest, perhaps one of the most important empires to ever exist on the face of the earth, why would it seem that all of a sudden we skip over that nation or that empire entirely and to some point yet to be in the future? Perhaps I think the greatest evidence, and again I draw this from my study this week and one commentator, is found for us in verse 7 of chapter 12. Look at verse 7 in chapter 12. Just turn over there just for a moment. Daniel has just asked the question, how long will it be? And he says, I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish scattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. I think in my interpretation, it seems that what we find in a reference thereto is that destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And if that would be the interpretation of what we find there in chapter 12 and verse 7, then it would seem very logical that what we find in verses 36 down through the verse 45 is that description of the Roman Empire that reigned from the time after the Greek Empire until the time of Christ and until the time of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Which leads us to the question, then who is the king? If it's not Antiochus the Great, if it's not the Antichrist, then who is it? Now, before I begin, I want to reiterate the point that many great teachers are in variance on the identification of this individual. I do believe, however, that it's clear that the application has to do with someone who was alive in that period of time. Two of the closest of those would be either the Caesars of Rome or Herod the Great, who was the king of Judea, but who was put into his position by Rome. He served under the Roman power and authority. So I don't want you to walk away this morning and saying that I think that I am more knowledgeable or more wise than any other Bible scholar on this issue. This is a very hotly contested part of Daniel chapter 11. But I believe in my study that as we look at this, and if we view this as a continuation of this outline of history, moving to the Roman Empire, that the character or the figure of Herod the Great falls in perfect alignment with what we find happening here in the latter part of this chapter. Again, in defense of this viewpoint, Philip Marrow says this. He said, it would be strange indeed if in an outline where it gives such prominence to Xerxes, Alexander, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, Antiochus Epiphanes, and the Maccabees, there were no mention of that remarkable personage who exerted upon Jewish affairs and destinies an influence greater than they all, and who sat upon the throne of Israel when Christ was born. Again, referring to that person, Herod the Great. I want you to notice here as we talk about this, some different things that help us to understand that this figure refers to Herod. Now again, we don't have time this morning to unfold each and every part of this, but again, I would refer you to those two books earlier if you want a more depth look at this. Verse 36 tells us that this king will do as he pleases, and will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. Herod was the first of his lineage to rise into power. But his descendants will continue until that time when the temple is destroyed in AD 70. Herod rose up from an obscure place. He was not well known. He was not a wealthy person, but rose into a great position of power, which he kept for a long time. He was able to do a lot while he was in power. He was a very wise, a cunning, and shrewd man. He knew what he needed to do in order to remain in power, and he was not willing to do anything that would tempt him or doubt him in the light of the Roman Empire in order to be removed from power. He accomplished a great deal politically. He accomplished a great deal architecturally. He was able to build great buildings and stuff in the cities. But he also ruled in a very tyrannical manner. Most notably, which we'll refer to in just a moment, you remember it was Herod who had all the male babies killed when Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem. Later on, he would murder his wife, and then he would also put to death 3 of his own sons. So he was not without his extreme faults and shortcomings. But it says he will exalt himself and magnify himself amongst the gods. Herod sought to position himself in a position of authority over everyone in the land of Judea. He did not want anyone to have a greater or higher authority than he, even including the priests. he would put himself into a position of power in order that he would even control who the priests were, because he didn't want any of them to think or to proclaim that they had a greater power or position than he did. Now, we referred just a moment ago to the murder of the male children when the wise men arrived there in Bethlehem in order to, or was on their way to Bethlehem to find the arrival of the Christ child. You remember Herod had all of the male children slain, and that was his way of eliminating the threat to the throne that he saw. You see, Herod had the same perspective as much of the Jewish people did, that a king or the arrival of the Messiah would be one who would rise to power in his lifetime, that it would be a person who would grow up, ascend to the throne, and physically take over the kingdom again. They had no concept in their mind of a humble servant king who would come, who would die, and then later on would return again. So Herod in his mind thought, well, if I'm going to remain in power, if I'm going to be the one who's victorious, if I'm going to be the one who is above every person, who's above every god, then I'll have to eliminate this. So he had all of the male children killed. And basically, this was a way of his, this was a violent act against God, where it says there he will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. Basically, it's describing Herod's position or statement that he's going to do anything he can to eliminate the possibility of the arrival and the rise of the Messiah, that no one else would be in his position on his throne. Now, look at verses... Excuse me, I'm missing a page here. Look at verses 37 and down through verse 38. It says, he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor will he show any regard for any god, for he will magnify himself above all. Now, that's an interesting phrase there. It's an interesting phrase because what does it mean there, right? Especially that phrase there, he will show no regard for the desire of women. Well, Herod was of somewhat of Jewish descent. He came from somewhat of a Jewish descent, so you would think that he would have respect, that he would have submission to the gods of his fathers. We would not expect a foreign king who came into the nation of Judea to have any respect for the gods of Israel, right? Because he's a foreign king. He comes in, has no desire. But because Herod is believed had somewhat of Jewish heritage, it's believed that he, or would think that he would come in and at least have some respect there, but he didn't. He was fully and completely all concerned with his own power and his own authority. Now that second phrase, again, is somewhat confusing. What does it mean by the desire of women? Well, this is in fact a reference to actually Jesus himself. You remember what the scripture talks about him, that he is the desire of nations. And what this scripture is referring to, and again, this is in agreement pretty much with all commentators of what this interpretation specifically means, is that this desire of women speaks to the idea of Christ being the desire of all of the women of Israel, that they would be the one who was chosen to give birth to the Messiah. Because the people knew, the Jewish people, even though they didn't understand how all of this was going to unfold, they knew that God had promised that a Messiah would come through the lineage of David. They knew that a Messiah would come, that he would be a part of the household of David. So all of these women had this desire, perhaps I will be the one. Perhaps I will be the one who is the mother to this one who will rise up and be God's chosen one. So Herod had no regard for the gods of his fathers, no regard for Jesus Christ, who was the desire of women. He says, nor will he regard any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. This is the wickedness of Herod, that he would not bow down to anyone, that he put himself in such a great position of authority, and in his mind saw that there was no one who was greater than he. But notice there in verse 38, Verse 38 tells us, but instead he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasure. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will give them great honor, and will acknowledge those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. You remember, Herod here is serving under the will of the Roman government. And so as part of that, he's serving the Roman government, he's serving them, and he also is paying them and giving them costly stones and treasures, giving them all these things. And in submission to them, giving them the honor that they demand from him. So as he builds his kingdom, he does so under the subjection of the Roman government, because he knows that they are the ones who put him there, and he has to keep them happy. So that's what we find described to us there in verses 38 and 39. Now in verse 40, we find a pause here, not just in, we don't move away from Herod per se, but we do move and shift directions for just a moment, where we find the Roman government and Caesar Augustus moving in a battle against Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt. So what happened here was Cleopatra and Mark Antony decided that they were going to come and attack the nation of Rome. And as they began to head out, they arrived on the scene, and in the immediate part of the Actian War, they experienced victory. But during the course of that battle, the battle moved not from a land battle, but to a navy battle. And certainly the Romans were able to overpower the Egyptians. And as they did, the Egyptians fled back to the nation of Egypt. And after that, Cleopatra and Antony began to make a move towards the south. They began to chase after the Egyptians. And we find this described for us here in verse 40. It says, at the end time, the king of the south, again, this would be Cleopatra and Mark Antony, will collide with him. And the king of the north, again, that's Caesar Augustus, will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships, and will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. So, at the beginning of this battle, Herod had aligned himself first with Cleopatra and Mark Antony. And as the battle began to turn and the Egyptians were defeated and they began to flee, then Caesar Augustus came down, and Herod knew his place, so he jumped teams, as it were, and put himself on the side again of Caesar Augustus. As they entered in there in verse 41, he says, he will enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, and there will be rescued out of his hand Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. As Caesar Augustus makes his way down on his way to Egypt, he enters through Palestine and through Judea. Herod joins his team, and they continue to move down towards Egypt. Verse 43 describes the moment when the Roman government made it to Egypt, seized the treasures that were there, and took over the things that were happening in Egypt. Now, we come now to the end of this verses 44 and 45. Notice here, now we're back to just specifically speaking of King Herod. It says, but rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. I think for me, this may be one of the clearest points of this chapter, or these verses that point again to this identifying person being Herod the Great. What are these things of the east and these things from the north? Well, you remember, at the beginning of Matthew, we find outlined for us that Herod is in great position and power. He's doing exactly what he wants to do. And suddenly there arrives 3 men from where? From the east. And they come with a message that a new king has arrived, that they've come to bear homage to this new king. And Herod, it tells us in the scripture in Matthew that he's greatly disturbed by this news. So now he's disturbed by this news from the east. Now what is the news from the north? Well, the news from the north is that his son, who was in Rome, had written a letter to him. Now, a lot of Herod's sons were just as deceivious and evil as their father was. But his oldest son was in Rome, and he wrote a letter telling him that his 2 other sons, who Herod had chosen to be the ones who would reign after him, that they had gone to Rome as well, and that they had been lying to Caesar and telling Caesar false things about their father. Now notice it tells us that because of these rumors from the east and these rumors from the north, that he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. Because of the news of the rumor from the east about the arrival of the Messiah and the arrival of this new king, Herod had all of the male children killed. Because of the arrival of the news from the north about his sons, Herod had his sons killed. And later on after that, as a result of that, he would have other people killed that were tied into in connection with this moment. Now, verse 45 tells us he will pitch his tents of his royal pavilion between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Herod had the temple rebuilt there in Jerusalem. But as he had the temple rebuilt, it was not just for the worship that was necessary for the people of God. He had it built as a basically as a palace for himself. So this is what we find here. He has put his place here between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. He has positioned himself there in the temple. But I want you to notice here again a definitive thing, I believe, describing the end of Herod's life as we come here to the end of verse 45. He will come to his end and no one will help him. We know that Scripture tells us that Herod died from a dreadful disease. Now, it wasn't until just a few years ago, or relatively recently, that scholars were able to determine what exactly it was that killed King Herod. King Herod died of chronic kidney disease that actually ended up killing him because it turned into gangrene. So we understand in the period of time in which Herod lived, there's nothing that you're going to be able to do, number one, for chronic kidney disease, but there's especially nothing you're going to be able to do for gangrene. And I can't, in good company or in mixed company this morning, describe what they say happened to Herod at the end of his life. But it was very grotesque, very personal, and very private. But there was nothing that could be done for him. Herod suffered a very painful, agonizing, humiliating death at the end of his life, which is described for us here in verse 45. He will come to his end and no one will help him. No one could help him. Herod had this disease that could not be fixed, it could not be cured, and God used his power and authority to bring Herod to such an end that no one could do anything to help King Herod at the end of his life. Now, as we come to the end of this chapter, and again, I apologize this morning, I know that was a lot of information packed into a very short period of time. But the question that's probably you're sitting there this morning is, why? What does this mean? What is the purpose? Why would God give all of this to Daniel in this chapter? And what does it mean for Daniel? What does it mean for us? Well, it's really found there in what we described, and perhaps ad nauseum throughout this entire study, is that it's just a beautiful, clear, concise, as it can be, but a beautiful picture of the sovereignty of God. For Daniel, it would have relayed to the people and encouraged the Jewish people that as these events begin to unfold over time, as the Medo-Persian Empire fell by the wayside and the Greek Empire rose up, and Alexander the Great and those who would come after him, and after the Greek Empire was destroyed and the Romans rose up, and after they suffered under all these countless rulers, and especially during the time when they suffered under the rule of Antiochus and Epiphanes, and he was destroying and desecrating the temple, the people of God could look back to the book of Daniel and they could see none of this is happening by accident. None of this is happening by chance. None of this is happening out of the hand of the authority and the permission of the divine will of God. And even though it was difficult, even though they suffered, even though it was painful and it hurt, and it was the most perhaps miserable time for the nation of Israel, they could look with hope in knowing that it would not last forever and that it was not by accident. Brothers and sisters, be encouraged today. For the people of Daniel, they could look forward, and as all these things unfolded over time, they can see it. We have the glorious ability now to look back and to see how perfectly God laid everything out. Hundreds of years before it happened, God perfectly laid out the course of human history. And be encouraged this morning, He's not stopped. God knows exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. He knows what's going to happen 3 weeks from now. Be encouraged. God knows what's going to happen in November. He knows what's going to happen next year and 10 years after that. And brothers and sisters, we may suffer. We may find ourselves in difficulty, but there's also going to be times of great joy. That's the human life. We don't escape from it as Christians. Being a Christian does not mean that it's a life of perpetual happiness and good times all the times. Now, we have the joy of the Lord that remains with us at all seasons, but we're going to face death. We're going to face sickness and trial and tribulation. But the glorious good news comes for here. God has pointed out that He is sovereign over it all. Nothing is happening outside of the divine permission of God. That's what we find in this chapter. We come to the end, and although we have seen kings rise and fall, all of them rose and fell under God's permission and allowance and purpose. Not one king, no matter how great. We look at Alexander the Great, probably one of the greatest military and powerful leaders that's ever lived on the face of the earth. Alexander the Great rose to power because God said, that man. And Alexander the Great fell from power because God said, you're done. And in the midst of it, God accomplished every single thing along the way that He intended to. God is sovereign over the world. God is sovereign over the nations. God is sovereign over rulers. And brothers and sisters, God is sovereign over the past, the present, and the future. We do not serve a God who sits in heaven wondering what's going to happen next. We do not serve a God who sits in heaven wondering or waiting for the acts of men to be accomplished so then he can decide what to do. No, we serve a God who before the foundation of the world has already set into place everything that's going to happen through the entirety of the history of this world. And we can find comfort in that. We can find comfort in the hope and strength that we find in the hands of a sovereign God who rules over all. Let's pray. Father, this morning we thank you for this time.